Octopath Traveler has become a bit of an influential game, not necessarily much because of its gameplay or even traditional storytelling, but a lot of it has to do because of its visual style and visual prowess, and it's something that almost even monikered a completely new phrase with HD2D. So in this video, I want to try to break down and give you some examples of just 7 upcoming game releases that utilize this very distinct and very interesting visual style that takes direct inspiration from Octopath Traveler. And there's no better place to start with obviously Project Triangle Strategy. This is a Square Enix JRPG and strategy RPG coming directly from the same creators of Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler, or at the very least, some of the key creators. That's still utilizing that same 2D meets 3D would-be ideas like their predecessors and visual style. While gameplay does focus strategically on tactical role-playing aspects and essentially a grid battle system like you would have seen in a Final Fantasy Tactics, it is utilizing that same visual prowess and that same visual idea, 2D sprites in a 3D environment with an isometric or sometimes over-the-top, over-the-shoulder type of third-person look and perspective, with shimmering effects, tons of motion blur, and a constantly moving camera that gives it that diorama feel and look to the world that's not necessarily something you've often seen in the past, especially when it comes to pixel art. Now the game is still just in development, but Square Enix did put out a demo that's available on the Nintendo Switch eShop, which you can actually go ahead and play, and actually the developers are requesting that you can go ahead and give them feedback on how the game should be progressing and some of the aspects that you might like or not like, so they could actually take that into account when developing the game, which is still set to release sometime next year. One of the most impressive reveals that we saw heading into the E3 season of 2021 was Dragon Quest 3D HD. And what you see here is directly what Octopath Traveler originally envisioned. A bird's eye view camera from a 2.5D view perspective, like almost isometric, with the same visual style like pixel art presentation, blur, tons of shimmering, and that distinct outer edge blur that's not necessarily in your focal view, but more directly relegated to the outer sides of the screen, essentially where you're not necessarily focusing too much where the action should be happening. Square Enix, in fact, during their presentation, this is a whole Dragon Quest event that they held, made very clear that this is one of their big HD 2D type of remakes that hopefully following Dragon Quest games could also get the same treatment going forward. So it's not like this is just a one and done idea that they're focusing to actually bring back, but actually focus on going forward. So once again, this is just Octopath vision and idea being brought to life in a completely different franchise that, of course, fans of the series were excited to see. Eiyuden Chronicle's 100 Heroes is probably one of those games that if you're a JRPG fan, you already know everything about. And that's because this is essentially a spiritual successor to one of the best JRPGs ever made, Suikoden and Suikoden 2. This is coming directly from the same creators, although with a completely different development team, and it was a rather popular Kickstarter project last year. And as you can see, it's still using that 3D scenery all the way around it, while the characters are still being displayed in 2D sprites, while slowly moving and giving them that almost realistic world type of environment, where they're almost moving in this big box and giving them their very own look and style. Now the developers are saying very openly that this is a process. This isn't a game that is ready to come out anytime soon. I believe the projected release date is sometime in 2023, and that's mostly because this is a brand new team, a brand new project, something that they're building essentially from scrap, and is looking to be just as ambitious as the Suikoden games used to be. They're proclaiming that their stories is spun into a force that reshapes history, where each one of the characters has a focal point and a real purpose to their world. There is also something like a spin-off already in the works, which is called Eiyuden Chronicles Rising, which I'm not necessarily too sure if it'll make full use of that same visual style, but it's also within that same realm of ideas that they're trying to implement. Stepping away from the JRPGs, one of the most interesting visual style games that we saw during the Microsoft presentation during E3 2021 was clearly replaced. This is a essential dark alternative 80s game with a 2.5D retro futuristic platformer type of idea that is set to release sometime next year. According to developers, it's set to combine cinematic platforming with pixel art and a free-flowing set of action inspired by combat and deep engaging dystopian stories. Now, like most of the JRPGs that we've talked about already, this one is pretty much an action platformer. So you have a very single specific character moving across the screen, but that same effect is also being added in just about every single way. That Octopath DNA is just right there as you can see it without having to think too much of it. What this game is doing a little bit different is that it's actually adding a couple of layers to it. And this is taking that same idea from Bravely Default. If you remember in the very original game back on the 3DS, it essentially used that 3DS aspect to almost the fullest for that very specific handheld, where there was a forefront, a middle ground, and the background all being separated through the 3D effect. This game is taking that very same idea without obviously the inclusion of any sort of 3D effects, but is using its layering to make the best use of it possible. As far as I'm aware, this is just an Xbox exclusive PC type of game that is obviously coming to Game Pass just like everything else, so of course do keep an eye out for that if you do own an Xbox. Now, one of the reasons why Replace made such a big splash during E3 for Xbox, specifically their presentation, was because when it was officially revealed for the very first time when we actually saw it, it looked very similar like The Last Night. This is a game that Microsoft revealed back in 2017 during their very own E3 presentation. The Last Night is a 2.5D platforming game where the player controls Charlie, a lower class man living in an era of leisure, where computers of machinery have taken over the menial work and players can have Charlie explore the city and essentially make him do whatever he wants. But this is a very directly cyberpunk inspired game with that very same idea. Several layers imposed on top of each other with pixel art galore, and it looks beautiful. Now the sad part is, right after the reveal there was a little bit of a controversy with I guess the lead developer or something along those lines that essentially pushed the game back, if not almost got it cancelled. So we haven't necessarily heard about anything when it comes to this game actually still being worked on or anything like that, so which is a bit sad because again the visual style was extremely beautiful. But again, it's one of those things where, like, you know, it's just a bad story that hopefully it does get redeemed at some point in the future. Now, another game that was revealed during E3 is Sacrifier. This one is blending real-time and turn-based combat and tells the story of Eiyuden, a young soldier in training that joins an elite set of holy warriors who keep the subterranean city of Anticoth safe from the demons roaming the surface. Now, I believe this one was also a Kickstarter project that was successfully funded, but it's very much an indie project nonetheless. It doesn't necessarily have the backing of Microsoft or even Nintendo for anything like that, so there is a very obvious limited budget here at work. But that visual prowess and that visual idea, again, the same thematic presence of a foreground, a background with all pixel art and different effects, making it look like a diorama in a completely moving and living world, is very much alive here. Now, out of all the games that I've already talked about, this one was probably the one that got the most backlash because it was essentially called an Octopath clone for whatever reason, which again, maybe just the fact that it was just an indie game, not necessarily backed by a big company, created that backlash. I'm not necessarily sure, but it was one of the very first times that I actually heard like, oh, it's an Octopath clone, therefore it made it sound like it was a negative thing, which again, it should have never been to begin with. The fact that they're just using that same idea and the template of visual style doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing to begin with, but it was the very first time that I heard about it in that sense. Now, the last game that I'm going to talk about here is one of them I'm trying not to mispronounce, but it's called Anomu Teonam. And this one's a weird one for very many reasons. First, it was originally revealed to be a PlayStation, PC, and Nintendo Switch Xbox game that was essentially coming to all consoles, but then eventually the Chinese development team made it very clear that it was just coming to PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and PC, and since then we've heard almost nothing regarding the Xbox or Switch releases. But this one, of course, is combining the 2D and 3D models with action-adventure gameplay, sprites and polygons galore, while throwing some RPG elements and letting the whole thing come alive in a bustling cyberpunk world. And if you're starting to wonder why these Octopath Traveler style games always influenced or seem influenced by a cyberpunk world or idea, I don't necessarily have an answer to that. But it does seem to me like because of the visual style, it does blend very self a lot to that same idea of like developers who want to make a cyberpunk style game use the most freshest or newest ideas, essentially this new HD2D, to make it come to fruition. Now hopefully I've been able to introduce just about 7 games to you guys. If you love that look of Octopath Traveler, you're gonna definitely want to keep your eyes peeled for more of these games, because I don't expect this to be the end of it. In fact, I expect more games to actually start making use of this HD2D type of visual style into the future and going forward. So if you did find this video helpful, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!